How's it going, guys? In this video we are going to be dropping the fuel tank in this 1991 Honda CRX. And so the very first thing before we get started is to disconnect the battery terminal from the battery. We don't want to generate any sparks because we are working with very combustible stuff, so please be careful and safe. Don't use any tools or heaters that might create a spark either while you're doing this, because again, really big fire hazard. But once you've done that, the next step in this process is going to be removing the little passenger luggage storage unit that they include in the cabin of the car. So if you lift up this guy, you can see that there are a bunch of holes where they put about 6 Phillips screws. So once you do that, this thing will just lift up and out, and then that will expose a little metal cover for the actual fuel tank. So that's the metal piece here. There's 3 Phillips screws that hold that down. And then once you get that out of the way, what you have here are a little 3-prong connector. This is also how you test the fuel voltage, or the voltage going to the pump from the harness. So you're going to disconnect that. And then there's another connector right here. You lift up on this rubber boot. It's a green connector, and then you would just depress a tab right there and lift up. And that's all you need to do from the inside of the car. Also, just make sure you tuck these cables underneath the frame because you don't want to tear them out when you're dropping the actual tank. This is the fuel sending unit. The actual fuel pump is right about here. And so once you've got that all disconnected, that's everything you need to do from the interior of the car. And then you're going to go underneath the car. And I highly recommend having an empty fuel tank before you do this, because it'll make your life a lot easier. If you don't, which is the boat that I was in, you're gonna have to store your gas somewhere, because having 10 gallons of gas makes this thing about 80 or 90 pounds heavier, which is a lot of weight. If you're, so basically, I have my gas in this thing right now. It's a 12-gallon tank. I just bought it for this job, and that's where I'm keeping it. In terms of draining the gas before you get started with anything underneath the car, the way to do that is, and we're on the driver's side right now, I'm gonna go underneath. There is a 17 mil drain plug right here. So this is the far end of the driver's side of the tank. And then from there, I highly recommend having a funnel and also making sure this car's level, because if it isn't, the gas will stick to the top of this gas tank, and in my case it ended up leaking a bunch on the floor. So just be really careful when you're doing this stuff. Next, what you're going to do is you're going to have a bunch of hoses to disconnect. So the first hose is right here. That's a 14 mil. You should use a box end wrench if you can. I used a crescent wrench and a hammer to kind of do impacts on this thing to break it free, but ideally 14 mil box end. I didn't have that tool, but that's what you would use. And then you've got 2 10 mil bolts that hold this other part of the fitting against the car frame, so you got to disconnect that. And then once you've done all that, there's one hose, a second hose right here. These are not the stock clamps. I put on these Jubilee clamps because I prefer these to the ones you have to like pinch and then move away. I just think these are a lot easier to work on if I have to do this again. So you're gonna have to pinch the clamp, slide it off. Lube is your best friend on this one. So what I did is I used a vice grip to kind of hold this thing down, shot some lube in the little gap, and then I just wiggled this thing to kind of work the lube around between the hose and the actual metal fitting. And then just keep kind of working it back and forth and sliding it down and off these attachment sites. So you gotta disconnect that hose. That's hose number 2. Hose number 3 is this red hose. It might be black. I'm not sure, you know, car to car might be different, but this hose needs to get disconnected, just pulls off. And you've got 2 more hoses right there that you got to remove. That's the fuel filler hose, and I believe that's a fuel return line. And so these, again, just be really careful. You don't want to tear these things. You don't have leaks in these, because that's how you get terrible gas mileage or risk fires. But basically undo these 2 clamps and then move them off, shoot some lube between the hose and the actual metal, and then just kind of gently work this thing back and forth and slide it off of those. And that's what you need to do in terms of the hoses. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hoses in total that you need to disconnect in order to drop this tank. Once you've got all the hoses disconnected, and the drain plug has been removed to get all that gas out. And you've also got the electrical connectors, the two up top, removed. Now you can actually start loosening up the tension on these metal bands that they have. And so if you look back there, you can see how it's literally, there's no attachment site. You just, once there's no tension, you can slip this out. But right now, this is on that side, just held in there with some friction or tension. And then on the other side of the band is this thing right here. And so you can see how you just use a 10 mil wrench and you just loosen that bolt right there. And as you loosen it, the tension in this metal band, it has a rubber coat on the other side of it between the metal and the tank, just so it doesn't cut into this tank. But as you loosen this, the tank will begin to drop. There's a second band right over there. There's also a heat shield right there. There are 4 10 mil bolts you need to remove to get that heat shield off. And then once you've done that, you can take off that second band. And then I supported this with a jack stand, like that guy right there. And then I just lowered this thing. And just be really careful. If there's gas in this tank, as you're lowering it, it will slosh out, so you will have spillage. And in my case, where most of the gas came out, as you're lowering this thing, even if you've tried to drain as much as you can, and I did, you still will have some residual gas in this kind of top or more forward part of the tank. That gas will slosh out and come out of that right there. So ideally you could like put a little cap right there maybe if you wanted to be really careful as you're doing this. But yeah, so just lowering it, and then once you've done that, you should be good to go. And installation is the reverse of this process. And so yeah, if you're doing this job, just please be really careful. It is dangerous stuff. And yeah, I hope this helps, and I'll show some clips of how I did this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time. All right guys, so we finally got the fuel filler hose removed and the fuel return hose, I believe, removed. That was painful. I hate these style of clamps. That's what it looks like. In addition to these 2 hoses, there's also this maybe red hose, sometimes it's black, but it goes up into there. That was another clamp removed. And then there was this hose right here removed. And then we also had this nut right here that attaches into the threads of here. And there are 2 10 mil nuts that hold it up onto there. And so these are all the hoses that needs to be removed. This was the most difficult part of this job. I am not a fan of this. I hate inhaling fuel vapors, but we got it. My fuel filler nut here was leaking a little bit, so I tightened it. But now we're going to be actually undoing these 10 mil nuts right here to loosen up the bands that hold this fuel tank up against the actual frame of the car. So there's one right here, and there's another guy right there. And then once we do that, this thing will lower. There's about 4 gallons of gas in here, so I'm gonna try to capture it just so I don't have to inhale as much of it. But yeah, and then we're able to get out that fuel tank. All right, also here's what it looks like. I sprayed some penetrating fluid on this before, but these are 12 mil bolts actually, not 10. And these are what hold the bands on. And so basically you gotta hold, there's a nut behind it that you gotta hold still as you loosen the lower bolt on this thing. And then once you do that, you should be good to go. So that's what it looks like. There is a washer and then a nut that goes on, and it sandwiches that guy right there. Sorry, these are terrible angles, but that is the band. It leads up to there, and that's what it looks like underneath the fuel tank. And so this thing also, sorry, just kind of comes up. I don't know if you guys can see that, but there's a little opening right there. That guy just slips in and out of. And so I'm going to dunk this in some CLR just to try to get some of this dirt and rust off it. And then I'm going to support this gas tank now, because the only thing that's holding it up is that one other strap. So once you do that, this tank will be ready to fall down, so it needs to be supported. So if you look there, that's the heat shield. There's one, I believe that's a 10 mil bolt
There's a second one right there, and then there's a third one on the other side of that guy. Sorry if I can't show it, but it is in there somewhere. Yeah, you guys can see that. So once you get those 3 10mm bolts out, you can get this heat shield off, and then that'll give you enough clearance to drop the tank.